Since I took office, I have been proud to build on the work of all those giants who came before me to support our natural resources and to help all Americans get out into the great outdoors. We've protected more than 265 million acres of public lands and waters. That's more than any administration in history. We've seen more victories under the Endangered Species Act than any previous administration. We're restoring vulnerable ecosystems like the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias right here. We've designated new monuments and historic sites that better reflect the story of all our people. So along with those famous sites like Gettysburg, we can also see monuments to Cesar Chavez or Pullman Porters in Chicago. So as we look back over the last 100 years, there's plenty to celebrate about a national park system that is the envy of the world. But when we look to the next century, the next 100 years, the task of protecting our sacred spaces is even more important. And the biggest challenge we're going to face in protecting this place and places like it is climate change. One of the reasons I ran for this office was to make America a leader in this mission. And over the past 8 years, we've done just that. In 2009, we salvaged a chaotic climate summit in Copenhagen, establishing the principle that all nations have a role to play in combating climate change. And at home, we led by example with historic investments in growing industries like wind and solar that created a steady stream of new jobs. We set the first ever nationwide standards to limit the amount of carbon pollution that power plants can dump into the air our children breathe. From the cars and trucks we drive to the homes and businesses in which we live and work, we've changed fundamentally the way we consume energy. Now keep in mind, the skeptics said these actions would kill jobs. And instead we saw, even as we were bringing down these carbon levels, the longest streak of job creation in American history. We drove economic output to new highs, and we drove our carbon pollution to its lowest levels in 2 decades. And by sending a signal that this is going to be our future, a clean energy future, it opens up the floodgates for businesses and scientists and engineers to unleash high-tech, low-carbon investment and innovation at a scale that we've never seen before. So this gives us the best possible shot to save the one planet we've got. That's our most important mission, to make sure our kids and our grandkids have at least as beautiful a planet, and hopefully even more beautiful than the one that we had.
Television has disorganized people's experience so they can no longer relate their own lives and experiences to the world which television reveals to them. To relate with the world through television amounts to amusing ourselves to death. Today, this notion extends beyond television. The invention of the smartphone and tablet has brought with it a social impact where humans interface through text or images instead of voice or human interaction. Sometimes, humans are oblivious to what goes on around them. This may be due to distraction or blatant ignorance, but the impact is still the same. Corporations have developed and profited at the cost of the environment, while consumers have turned a blind eye towards the destruction of the wilderness and excessive consumption of natural resources. The ecosystem is changing, global warming is occurring, and humans have an expiration date that is approaching at an exponential rate. Humanity, and with it all life on Earth, stands at a crossroads. The precautionary principle must be used by all nation-states to extend the natural conditions required to support human life in a postmodern environment. The precautionary principle first emerged during the 1970s in the former West Germany at a time when social democratic planning was in vogue. Since then, precautionary principle has flourished, and now it is found in many international statements of policy, in the text of international conventions and protocols, and in national strategies for implementing sustainable development. Although the precautionary principle provides few, if any, operable guidelines for policymakers, it requires politicians to deliberate about the long-standing effects of proposed legislation and prompts action to ensure environmental impact is manageable for future generations. As such, a number of core elements to the precautionary principle can be identified: pro-action, cost-effectiveness of action, safeguarding ecological space, legitimizing the status of intrinsic value, shifting the onus of proof, mesoscale planning, and paying for ecological debt. Over the past 70 years, modern concerns about the environment have gone through a series of phases. One of the most important phases is that they tend to become increasingly globalized and are directly linked to the massive economic expansion since World War II. Each new decade brought a new phase of concerns. In the 1950s, concerns arose about the use of chemicals in agriculture and air pollution. In the 1960s, concerns about the degradation of the planet's environment caused by a rapid increase in population and economic growth. By the 1970s, the concerns of the previous decade had substantially influenced political positions, with many countries introducing legislation to combat pollution within the environment. In the 1980s, scientists began observing the negative impact of human activity on the global scale, such as the thinning of the ozone layer over the polar regions, and that's due to aerosols and refrigeration systems, and global warming due to greenhouse gases being released by fossil fuel consumption. In the 1990s, nation-states around the globe increased research funding through grants to produce alternative energy methods, while society was introduced to an array of new television shows that were focused on combating pollution while educating children. One example is the cartoon show Captain Planet, which aired on TBS from 1990 to 1996. In the past half century, the practice and study of global environmental politics and governance has been dramatically rescaled to become increasingly complex and interconnected with respect to the level at which they take place, the range of actors engaged in them, and the linkages between them and nominally non-environmental issues. This work, while progressive, has become counterproductive due to general misunderstanding of authority and responsibility amongst governments. Additional rescaling, which includes the precautionary principle, is required to unite nation states with a unified focus on environmental sustainability. The rescaling of global environmental politics must occur within three dimensions: the intergovernmental realm, the transnational realm, and across issue areas. In the beginning of this video, I showed a clip of President Barack Obama speaking about the global progression that was made throughout his term to support sustainability in an effort to preserve and protect nature for future generations and extend the resources available to support life on this planet. However, through democratic selection, our nation has veered away from this outlook. President Donald Trump, within a single term, has rescaled global environmental politics in a negative way, where the United States has turned a blind eye towards the unified focus on environmental sustainability. In fact, the Trump administration has dismantled the Clean Power Plan, blocked legislation which phases out inefficient technology that wastes power, refused to support bipartisan legislation to curb superpollutants from cooling systems and refrigerators, rolled back rules limiting methane pollution from oil and gas infrastructure, relaxed emission standards for cars and trucks, withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate change, and continues to completely disregard scientific data and recommendations from community leaders and professionals about nearly everything, from climate change to infectious disease. Humanity must recognize the destruction that is occurring amongst our settlements within nature and use precautions to limit or prevent irreversible damage to extend the natural conditions required to support human life in a postmodern environment. As we rescale our environmental politics using precaution on a global level, we foster a greater diversity of and more innovation in environmental policy and management. Each and every person holds a responsibility to self-identify and share their perspective on what natural things hold value, both scientifically and culturally, so that action can be taken to ensure such treasures are protected and preserved for future generations of humanity. Aloha and thank you.
If we seize the future, there's nothing we cannot do. I do not believe that any part of the world has to be condemned to perpetual poverty and hunger, and I do not believe that this planet is condemned to ever-rising temperatures. I believe these are problems that were caused by man, and they can be solved by man. We can unleash the change that reduces hunger and malnutrition. We can spark the growth that will release nations from poverty, and we can reverse the tides of climate change and usher in a smarter and more sustainable world. And I'm found quoting the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who believed that there is such a thing as being too late. When it comes to climate change, the hour is almost upon us. If we act boldly and swiftly, if we set aside our parochial interests in favor of the air that our young people will breathe and the food that they will eat and the water that they will drink, if we think about them and their hopes and dreams, then we will act, and it won't be too late. And we can leave behind a world that is worthy of our children, where there's reduced conflict and greater cooperation, a world marked not by human suffering, but by human progress. That is what we have to work on together.